This is hell.
The U.S. media only seems to see Putin when they report on Russia, and nothing beyond Putin. It's as if Putin is Russia, but is he, and can Russia operate as it does now without Putin, which is something everyone should be considering, as term limits and Putin's presidency will be ending Putin's presidency in 2024. Here to help us get past all of this Russia is Putin and Putin is Russia stuff, Tony Wood is author of Russia Without Putin, Money, Power, and the Myths of the New Cold War. Welcome to This Is Hell, Tony.
Thanks. My pleasure to be on here.
Tony is a member of the editorial board of the New Left Review. Tony is author of 2007's Chechnya, The Case for Independence. And if you're wondering, that is the same New Left Review that we just featured an article from with Dylan Riley on If Trump is a Fascist. If you haven't heard that interview, go back shortly after our show. Go to thisishell.com and you can hear that interview in its entirety. You write, it is hard to think of Russia today without thinking of Vladimir Putin, perhaps more than any other major national leader. He personifies his country in the eyes of the outside world. How accurate is our vision, our depiction of Russia when we see Russia as Putin and Putin as Russia? Does that mislead us from understanding Russia more accurately than we should?
Absolutely. I think that is the case. And that's the main reason I gave the book the title it has, that it really, when I say Russia without Putin, I'm not calling for regime change. It's really more a question of, it's an analytical gambit, right? That we need to look at Russia, the country, and once you see beyond the personality who happens to be in charge of it now, you have to ask a series of very different questions, and the relative importance of Putin declines somewhat.
You talk about his popularity, how well he does in the elections. Does Putin have a monopoly on the message within the media and to the public, or is he so popular that the media simply seeks him out? Is his popularity the result of a government mandate or simply by popular choice?
I think it's a bit of both, and I think partly because he's been the incumbent for so long that he just dominates the media landscape and the political landscape in a way that is quite hard for people to change. I think one thing that one does have to bear in mind, though, is the degree to which Putin's centrality is not something that has just organically happened, right? That it's a very curated artifact. And a lot of people have put in a lot of time to create this image and reinforce it. So really, when the Western media is overemphasizing Putin's importance there, they're not just distorting the view we have of Russia, they're buying into a very specific political project to emphasize his importance as well.
So do they emphasize his importance at their own risk? If these people are critics of Putin, are they empowering him by exaggerating his importance?
I think so, very much, yeah. I think it does tend to reinforce his power and to reinforce the sense that there is no one else who really matters in the Russian political landscape and that there are no alternatives. And I think this also has repercussions within Russia domestically. It's very hard for people within Russia to conceive of the country being run by anyone else. You know, there's a whole generation of people who've grown up now knowing nothing but Putin, and to the extent that it's very hard for people to imagine a replacement. But as you said at the top of the segment, that's going to happen in 2024. So people need to start being able to imagine that, and part of that process is thinking what a Russia without Putin would look like, what it would happen if someone else were in charge.
I was about to ask you how much of his popularity is tied to his lack of popularity in the West, and I still want to know the answer to that question, but more importantly now, because of something you were mentioning earlier, how much does Russiagate contribute to that popularity of Putin within Russia? Is his popularity tied to the lack of popularity elsewhere? And is that lack of popularity fueled by Russiagate?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think in a general sense, a Russian leader not being so popular in the West plays well domestically in Russia, certainly. I think there is this sort of generalized feeling that Russia was too passive, too disorganized, gave too much to the West in the 1990s, and so any leader, Putin or otherwise, who had somehow reasserted Russia's presence in the 2000s was going to be popular. And so Putin certainly did that and was unpopular in the West as a result of that. So I think people in Russia, speaking very very broadly tend to see the Western negative reaction to Russia's leaders as being a rejection of a stronger Russia, or at least stronger than it was in the 1990s. Whether Russiagate specifically plays into that, I'm less sure. I think one of the curious features of this whole Russiagate story is the degree to which the Western media and the Western reading public is obsessively focused on Russia in a way that Russians are not obsessively focused with the West in the same on the same wavelength. See what I mean? So this is one of those rare cases where people in a particular country are much less interested in the West than the West is in them on this particular point. And I think at a certain point, the Russiagate stuff may rebound on Russia's current leaders if it gets in the way of a normalization with the West. If it means relations with the West just keep getting worse and worse and make any kind of rapprochement impossible, I think that will eventually be unpopular.
How much is Putin a creation of Western policy toward Russia following the fall of the Soviet Union? Is the government of Vladimir Putin to what extent is that blowback to Western policy in pushing capitalism and not pushing democracy very much on Russia in the 1990s?
Yeah, this is a really good point. I mean, I try and develop this argument at greater length in the book. I mean, there's this general perception that in the 1990s you had the Yeltsin government, which was chaotic and somewhat disorganized, but nonetheless democratic and pushing through a free market transformation. And then all of a sudden in the 2000s you get Putin, who is more autocratic, pushing through a more statist economic policy. And so there's this idea of a contrast between these two men, and these being two very different periods. And actually in the book, I try and overturn that myth. I think really that Putin comes out of the Yeltsin era in a very direct sense. You know, he's the direct successor. He continues a lot of Yeltsin's work in terms of maintaining the neoliberal economic policy and extending it in some aspects. And so really what you see is a shift of emphasis in some areas, but really what Putin does is consolidate a system that Yeltsin built. So I see a lot of very significant continuities instead of a break between the two. And so to that extent, the Putin regime is really a product of those free market reforms of the 1990s that threw up a nominally democratic government that carried through a free market transformation and is very committed to capitalism and the principle of private wealth. And that's what Putin is. He's committed to all of those things. The other key thing to bear in mind really is that a lot of the sort of autocratic features of the Putin era, the election rigging and so on, were very much present under Yeltsin. The difference is really that the West was supportive of Yeltsin and, in many ways enabled his election rigging and various other kinds of authoritarian behavior. The obvious one being in 1993, there was a standoff between Yeltsin and the parliament. Yeltsin sent in tanks and literally bombed the parliament into submission. And that kind of behavior was widely applauded in the West. Putin has not done anything remotely as dramatic as that in Russia domestically. But he is obviously much more criticized for being an authoritarian figure. But again, what I try and emphasize in the book is really the points of commonality and continuity between these two men and these two periods.
So there are those here in the United States who just view Putin or Russia as Putin. Putin is Russia, and that he is an authoritarian, even to the point of being a dictator despite being elected. You were talking about vote rigging that happened during Yeltsin, and that's continued on during the Putin government. How legitimate is the leadership of Vladimir Putin, or is that even an inappropriate word to use? Because what would you say to somebody who says this guy took over Russia? The only reason that he's in power is because he's an illegitimate leader. He fixed the system to put himself in power.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two aspects to this that are worth bringing out. One is that, certainly I have no sympathy or positive views on Vladimir Putin himself or his policies, so I just should make that clear. None of this is said with any sympathy or support for the man. But one thing that's notable at him is that he is very much a sort of a stickler for the letter of the law, not the spirit of it. So if he has to win a democratic mandate, he will win a democratic mandate. Like, some of this is done through rigging, but essentially he will adhere to the letter of the Constitution. And this, for example, is why in 2008 he left the office of president, became prime minister for 4 years, and then came back as president, because that was what the Constitution said you had to do. He could have rewritten it, he could have done away with elections, but he's not that kind of authoritarian. If you like, he's a sort of literalist authoritarian Democrat. I don't know if that's a concept that makes much sense, but he does do what the law requires. But the other aspect that's interesting is that there is undoubtedly a lot of election rigging in Russia. But on the other hand, I think a lot of the time, and certainly Putin himself, would win a clean election if there were no rigging. On current trends, as far as I can understand this, and as far as all the poll data and political science literature within Russia I've looked at, he does have a genuine support base that would probably enable him to win a free and fair election currently. Mainly because of a lack of viable other candidates who have a large organized political structure to carry forward a presidential campaign. There are challenges, certainly, and one of the curious features of the current regime in Russia is that they are very quick to stamp down any kind of challenge, no matter how small. And from the outside, this seems to be somewhat irrational, right? That you have a challenger who may pull in, 3% of the vote. Why not let them run? And then you have the appearance of a democratic contest, but you still win with 60% of the vote, say, for example. But this is a system that is very keen to just not to make sure that no risks are taken. So any opposition at all, you've got to just clean it up and then proceed to hold what looks like a democratic election. You have the facade of democracy without the substance, essentially. And I think these are the sort of curious features of the regime where it will eventually run into some kind of problem where you have to rig something on a scale that just becomes unrealistic. And in that regard, I mean, I don't want to send your listeners too far afield, but it's not, to me, it doesn't seem wildly dissimilar to what happened in Mexico in the 1990s, for example, where the PRI regime, they stole a couple of elections, certainly very clearly rigged, and then eventually they ran out of steam to a point where you could not rig an election on that scale and still, run the country. And I think something similar to that may happen with this regime eventually.
You write by themselves. These three words might be read as straightforward, and those are anything but Putin. These three are Russia without Putin. These three words might be read as a straightforward call for regime change, as you were just saying. That is not at all the intention of this book. My argument, rather, is that Western media coverage and analysis of Russia are overly fixated on Putin's personality. Is that fixating on personality? Is that merely the nature of the news media beast here in the U.S.? Is this an indictment of the U.S. media focusing on personalities, not policies, especially when it comes to its international news coverage? Is this just the way that U.S. news media is, or is it in particular this way just with Putin?
I think it's a bit of both, certainly. There is a tendency in the media to focus on personalities, as you say, and these are much more convenient hooks. And this is also just the way our, celebrity-driven culture functions. And this is not just in the U.S., this is true in Europe too. And, and this is why you have so many countries now whose political landscape is being reduced to whatever surrounds a given individual, whether it's Putin in Russia or Erdogan in Turkey or Duterte in the Philippines. All of these quote-unquote strongmen have become the kind of obsessive focus of media attention. Some of that is definitely a generic feature of the way media works, I think, but I think it's particularly exaggerated in the case of Russia. And I think because Putin has been around for so long, it's just accumulated more and more force, and it's become increasingly counterproductive, I think. One of the things I found while working on this book was that really the general level of knowledge about Russia at the moment is, I personally think, probably lower than it was during the Cold War. And I think if you stop and think how perverse that is, right, during the Cold War, these were systems that were to some significant degree closed off from each other. It was not that easy to travel between the Eastern Bloc and certainly Russia and the West. It was much more difficult to get visas and so on. And now, nominally, it's easier to go back and forth, but people are much less well informed. And so I wanted to try and, do my bit to reverse that lack of understanding, but also just to describe it, that you have this really perverse outcome where the more Russia, supposedly has joined the world since the end of the Cold War, the less we've understood it.
You write the obsession with Putin's persona effectively reduces a whole range of political, economic, and social questions to the swings of one individual's mood or morality. At best, this is highly misleading, distracting us from the broader structural forces that have done so much to shape Russia's fortunes in the last few decades. What are those broader structural forces? And are we intentionally ignoring those broader structural forces? What do we miss when we ignore those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing that people perhaps, understand on a general kind of intuitive level, but haven't really been able to follow through the consequences of, is the sheer extent of the transformation that Russian society has been through in the last 20, 30 years. This is a really significant, major upheaval that's affected everyone alive, or at least everyone who was born and living, in 1991. Really, it's not just a change of regime from communist to capitalist. This is a total transformation of your whole day-to-day working life, your interactions with other people, a really deep change in culture, but also in class identity. I spend a lot of time talking about changes in class structure in Russia over that period of time. And so this is a really, really profound transformation. And I think that has all kinds of interesting side effects in terms of how Russians perceive themselves, both day to day, both in their individual lives, but also in their collective national life, like what kind of country they think they are, what role they play on the world stage. I mean, more or less every stable point of orientation for ordinary Russians has been taken away, and they've had to find a replacement. So part of the process for the last 20, 30 years has really been reorienting themselves in the world. And at the same time as that sort of systemic change has been happening, there's also been a lot of other changes that are very significant. For example, economic shifts, very major. This was, until the late 1980s, a major world industrial power. Admittedly, the industry was crumbling already and somewhat in decline, but nonetheless, Russia has been through a very rapid deindustrialization. And at the same time, it has become increasingly dependent on exports of raw materials, which has two consequences that I think are just briefly worth mentioning here. One is that it has it makes the whole economy more volatile, more dependent on swings and ups and downs in the global commodity markets. That's number one. But secondly, the country's main source of income does not employ that many people. So this is, the whole of the fate of the economy is really tied to a sector, in which most people are not employed. So it has this sort of, at least again in the Soviet Union, industry was a major employer. Some very large proportion of the population was employed in industry. And so the fate of industry, you could see that day to day. Whereas now the economy has become somewhat more kind of externalized to people's daily life and much more alien and inexplicable, which I think has contributed to the disorientation that people feel at this time.
To whose benefit does Russia operate? And I know that might sound like a leading question in some way, that would somebody ask that of the United States, to whose benefit does the U.S. operate? And I would say that the U.S. operates well for those who work within the market, and the better you work within that market and the better your ancestors worked within that market, the better the market works for you. And so the U.S. operates at the benefit of those who work well within the market, I guess. To whose benefit does Russia operate?
I think that there's two different criteria, really. I mean, on that level that you're describing, I mean, there is an element of that you've had a market economy take root in Russia, in which, people who work well within that particular market framework are rewarded. To some extent, that's true. But then also those opportunities within the market are very closely entangled with other forms of power, other forms of access to political power or connections. So there is a kind of an informal and formal set of factors that weigh on people's fortunes. And so a lot of the people who've done very well have been people who had some prior connection to a factory or like some sort of connection in the Communist Party apparatus, and they manage to gain ownership of the factory, say. Or there's a lot of lingering connections with the old order still hovering around. And then there are also people who manage to do well out of the chaos of the 1990s, who made their way, in the cracks of the system, essentially doing things that were semi-legal or not at all legal, and who have since managed to legitimize their fortune, if you like. And then, there are people who have enriched themselves just thanks to good luck of, they managed to operate a concession of some kind or work in a bank, and that bank's got hugely enriched thanks to some particular deal. I mean, I don't want to suggest that anyone who's done well in Russia is involved in some kind of crooked dealings, because in a way that is how the market works, right? It rewards disproportionately on a seemingly irrational basis, right? and I think some of that has happened in Russia. The real difference is the closeness of the relationship to political power. And I want to emphasize that this is something a lot of analysis sees as being particular to the Putin era, but actually this has been true throughout. This was true in the Yeltsin era as well, that a close relationship with political power was what enabled people to become rich. The difference really between Yeltsin and Putin in that respect is that it's just different people being enriched, but it's the same mechanism.
You're right. Putin did not create this system, nor will his removal from the scene alter its fundamental character. In order to understand Russia today, the West needs to shake off its obsession with Putin and look at what lies beyond the Kremlin walls. It needs, in other words, to learn to see Russia without Putin. All right, so what is that system? I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I have a different way of asking it. What is the system that he is currently operating, that he is currently being the administrator of? You mentioned how he has, to a certain extent, unified the dominant class. He's unified his political party. He has organization, a very large organization. That organization has a level of competence. All of these are characteristics that Dylan Riley was just mentioning on our show in our discussion of whether Trump is fascist. He said that Trump isn't fascist. He doesn't have the organization. He doesn't have the competence. He's not trying to get the dominant class together. He's breaking apart the party. There is no chance for mass mobilization in the United States that is necessary for the kind of fascism, at least from 1922 to 1939. So to what degree and can we even say that this is fascism? After all, he has got the dominant class and his political party to have unity, and he has the organization and the competence to install fascism.
Well, I would sound a note of caution on that too, actually, in Russia, because one of the characteristic features of the Putin system throughout, but also the 90s under Yeltsin too, was that this is a system which requires democratic legitimation, but is not overly keen on encouraging democratic participation. And that means they want people to turn out and vote when they're supposed to every 4 years, but they're not really interested in building a genuine mass movement. And so it's a curious feature that Putin has been in power all this time. And, they've set up the ruling party, United Russia, has existed since late 2000, early 2001, and controls the majority of seats in the parliament, not just at the national level, but also at the regional level, the different regional parliaments. But there is markedly less enthusiasm among the Russian public for the party than there is for Putin as a person. And so as a ruling party, this is a very I would say not a successful entity. It doesn't have any real mass appeal. I feel like there's no real loyalty among the public to the party. They just vote for it because it happens to be the ruling party. But interestingly, there were just some elections held in Russia in September, regional elections and local elections. And considering this is a ruling party that controls all access to, the media, all the finances, it's the incumbent everywhere, they really perform very poorly, and turnout is also always very low. So looking back to the criteria that you mentioned about having a kind of a mass movement, this is not, the Putin system doesn't really have a mass movement. It has, you could describe it, I think, as maybe mass acquiescence, but it's really not the same as the kind of energized mass support base that would be required for a fully sort of fascist project. That's one thing that I think is very different. And another thing is that the Putin regime really relies on apathy to some extent. It doesn't rely on any kind of mass engagement. The more apathetic the population, the better, as long as they just turn out and do what they're supposed to do every 4 years. But the second thing I think is that really the Putin regime is not fascist for another important reason, which is that, fascism to some extent requires a kind of coherent ideological project as well, a coherent vision of some kind of corporatist transformation, if you like. In my understanding of this. And I think one of the interesting features of the Putin era is how ideologically empty it has been. That it really is, it's a system that can contain a lot of different ideological currents, and Putin can tilt between these different currents depending on, the what is more powerful at the time, depending on the global economic climate. So in his early phase, in the early 2000s, he was much more markedly neoliberal. In the mid-2000s, he had a kind of slightly more statist turn, increase in state ownership in certain key sectors. When he came back in 2012, he had a much more nationalist ideological emphasis. But all of these emphases continue to coexist within Putinism, if you like, represented by different factions within the government. So this is a very sort of plural and I think not especially coherent project, ideologically speaking. And I think that marks it out from fascism as well, that there is no, in a way it suits Putin not to decide which of these tendencies to go for. He wouldn't go all out for any of them.
So would you characterize the debate within Russia today, the political debate within Russia today, between whether they should be pursuing statism, nationalism, or neoliberalism? Is that kind of the heart of the Russian political debate today?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly at the elite level, there's a question of what kind of state they want, whether they want to push on with a kind of much more, an even more neoliberal state, really cut back whatever is left of the social welfare infrastructure of the state. And that's something that they've been pushing on with a bit. Over this summer, they announced an increase in the pension age, and they've been doing all kinds of other sort of austerity measures in Russia. This is called optimization, which involves closing hospitals, cutting back doctor salaries. Also in education, a lot more what is called user fees, i.e. education is notionally free, but you pay more to use it. So there's been a kind of neoliberal push within Putinism that's been consistent, and I think that, again, this is one of the things I think people overlook because they're busy looking at Putin and his KGB background and seeing him as some kind of, return to the USSR, and that's not at all what's been happening on the ground in Russia. It's very much a neoliberal regime, I would say, with other ideological elements. The current debate, or certainly, again, within the elite level, is to do with how much money Russia should be spending on its military versus some kind of modernization spending on infrastructure, health, education. And this is one reason why the confrontation with the West, while it scores Putin certain points domestically, is not in their interest in the long run because they have to spend so much more on their military as part of that confrontational stance. And at a certain point, that becomes massively counterproductive for the country in the long run. And so there are these debates within the government. Putin, his former finance minister, Alexei Kudrin, who is now in some free-floating sort of think tank role, but clearly still close to the government, he has been promoting, on the one hand, more neoliberal measures, increasing the pension age, but on the other hand, he's been saying we don't need a military budget this size. What we need is to spend on roads, railway, infrastructure, and education. And so that really is where the future of the system will be played out. Will they, engage in some useful modernization spending, or are they going to be doomed to a kind of confrontation with the West that eats up a chunk of the military budget? At the moment, it does seem like, they have actually, again, this is passed over in much of the Western coverage, but they have cut the military budget 2 years running now. And the last cut was by something like 20%. It's quite significant. So the question is whether that continues in that direction or whether there's a new spike in spending for some other reason.
You write that the system's main priority has been to defend capitalism in Russia, if necessary, at the expense of democracy, as the consistent resort to election rigging from the 1990s to the present demonstrates. Here in the U.S., and especially on this show, we hear from critics who argue that the U.S. puts profits before people. Is Russia the epitome of what the left criticizes about the right here in the U.S.? Is Russia the epitome of putting profits before people?
I mean, yeah, not the only epitome. I think this is a consistent feature of a lot of governments worldwide, but it certainly does epitomize that tendency. I mean, I guess one thing that's curious to me is that within the current climate, obviously, there's so much hostility between Russia and the West, and a great deal of contrast supposedly between these systems. But actually, I feel like they have a lot more in common than people realize. And again, this was brought home to me. I was in Russia over the summer, and I attended a lot of these protests against the increase in the pension age. And one of the things that's clear is that the IMF has been sending missions to Russia to run the rule over their economic policy, and the IMF is delighted with Russia. You know, they come back and give them these glowing reports about the macroeconomic policy and what they're doing with pensions and so on and so forth. So really, in terms of the underlying economic agenda of these states, Russia is much closer to the West than many people would realize.
Very much closer to the West. You write many of Putinism's worst features are rooted in the socioeconomic order that has been in place since the fall of communism. How much is the current kind of capitalism that Russia's experiencing, how much is that a creation of the West? Did the U.S. and the rest of the West not bring democracy and capitalism as much to Russia as they brought the version of capitalism of its era, that they brought neoliberalism to Russia?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think there is this sort of consistent emphasis in Western coverage of Russia on the idea that Russia's transition to capitalism has been somehow incomplete, and that so what Russia has is not really capitalism, or it's capitalism somehow mitigated by remnants of the Soviet system, nostalgia for communism and all of that. Whereas what I see is actually what Russia has is capitalism, and actually a lot of the features that people see as negative, authoritarian culture, for example, those are actually features of the capitalism that Russia has. They're not, vestiges of the past that are in the way. On the contrary, they're part of the way that capitalism was implanted in Russia in the 1990s. And the West absolutely played a very prominent role, not only in supporting Yeltsin and helping him maintain his power and extending his term in office, for example. As many of your listeners will know, the U.S. played a direct role in stealing the 1996 Russian presidential election. But actually, on a very granular level, there were U.S. advisors writing legislation for the Yeltsin government. Like a lot of the legislation that privatized Russian industry was written by U.S. advisors to the Russian government.
So how much, you talk about this kind of relationship that Russia thought that they were going to have with the United States and with the West in the post-Soviet era, and then the West thought that they were going to have a different kind of relationship. You call this a one-sided fantasy of Russia, that it was going to be a partner with the West and the U.S. Instead of being partners in global capitalism. How did the U.S. and the West view what their post-Soviet relationship would be with Russia?
Well, this is an interesting question. I mean, I think I'm not totally clear I think the West had different ideas that were in play about how to deal with Russia, and it's really the more aggressive vision that has won out. There was initially an idea that the West could incorporate Russia as some kind of subordinate partner, right? Whether it would not be part of NATO or the EU, but it would be in close association with those structures as a kind of outside partner. But I think there was also a powerful body of opinion, mainly within the U.S. foreign policy establishment, but also in European capitals, that saw Russia as inherently an antagonist. That sooner or later there would be antagonism, and the question is one had to, how to prepare for that, and you should definitively exclude Russia from those structures because it was going to, ruin them or be a spoiler within them at some later date. And that second current of opinion is the one that won out. It's worth thinking back to the expansion of NATO when that first began in the early 90s, that there was a current of opinion within the U.S. foreign policy establishment that was against NATO expansion. And this included George Kennan, the original architect of containment. He called it a fateful error, essentially that this would needlessly antagonize Russia and just set up the same kind of antagonistic structure that had obtained during the Cold War, when there was an opportunity to have some different kind of relationship. So that has been the Western sort of tilt is towards a more aggressive view that sees Russia as outside of whatever structure the West has. The problem really is that the West also does not want Russia to align with China or India or these other powers that are not sort of within Europe. So I think the real contradiction in Western policy towards Russia, or rather the aspect of Western policy that makes it particularly difficult to see how this is going to get better, is that there is really no place where Russia can be fitted comfortably. There is no role for Russia that I can see that the West is willing to accept, except as a fully subordinate power. And unfortunately, I think no democratically elected Russian leader, Putin or anyone else, would be able to carry forward that policy. So I think we are going to be stuck in some kind of antagonistic relationship with Russia for a while, unless the West really rethinks where it thinks Russia should fit in the world.
You write we need to discard several of the core assumptions behind most discussions of Putin's Russia. First, there is the widespread notion that Putin has overseen a nostalgic return to Soviet times, reversing the market reforms and democratization carried out by Yeltsin in the 1990s. And as we've discussed already, that's not the case. But this week, Newsweek reported a higher percentage of Russians regret the collapse of the Soviet Union than at any other time since 2004. According to a new survey by the Levada Center, a Russian nonprofit organization, today 66% of Russians surveyed say that they regret the end of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism. Many Russians said that they regret losing the single economic system that existed in the Soviet Union, while others say that they miss living in a great world superpower. Older respondents expressed the most nostalgia. So to what degree? I mean, here we have Newsweek telling us that Russians, all they want is to go back to the era of the Soviet Union. To what degree is Russia and is Putin taking them back to the era of being the Soviet Union, of being a world power again?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, like the degree to which this nostalgia has any real political consequences and has any actual embodiment in policy, if you like. I mean, I think certainly the fact that Putin has reasserted Russia's relevance on the world stage, that is a key part of its popularity. The idea that whether or not Russia gets on with other countries, they at least have to take account of its interests. That is something that I think is widely popular. And again, not just Putin, but any Russian leader who did that would gain popularity as a result of that. In terms of actual nostalgia for the Soviet Union, I think some of this, I think one has to remember, going back to what I was talking about earlier, the degree of social transformation that this country has been through in the last 30 years, certainly that's taken up a lot of Russian people's lifetimes at the moment. But they have been through that degree of social transformation, but at the same time through a kind of national crisis in terms of the collapse of an empire, effectively. What is this country's role on the world stage? And there's been an increasing disproportion between that memory of the importance of the Soviet Union, the scale of it, its superpower status on the one hand, and on the other hand, Russia's current capacities, which are massively lowered, and it's actually, in global terms, it's economically a mid-ranking power, along with many others, militarily much diminished. So there's this mismatch between the memory of what they used to be and the current capacities. And what I would say is that, as someone who grew up in the UK, this sort of post-imperial syndrome is very common, and certainly I think Britain, France, other imperial powers have not dealt with this at all well either. There's a lot of political consequences that flow from this inability to handle the end of empire, and you could even see Brexit as part of that phenomenon. So I think Russia is not alone in having these difficulties in adjusting to a changed role in the world. And to some extent, I feel like this nostalgia really reflects the difficulty of adjustment rather than being an actual program. I think if a politician arrived and said, yes, let's restore the Soviet Union, but we'll have to go and invade all these countries to do it, I don't think that would be popular. I mean, a real indication of this is the fact that the war with Ukraine was not popular in itself in Russia. Certainly, the Putin regime successfully portrayed the post-Maidan government as supposedly a group of fascists and, in the pocket of the West and so on and so forth. And that kind of antagonistic propaganda played well. But the actual military side of this conflict was not at all popular because Russians, with whatever historical complexities and contradictions, see themselves as being very closely tied to Ukrainians. They're very closely into, a lot of intermarriage, a lot of movement between these spaces. And the idea of waging war in order to regain territory, I think, would be very alien to most Russians these days. So it's not a nostalgia that has an outlet in a political project, I would say. It is about adjusting to Russia's new place in the world and regretting the loss of power, I think. And again, in global comparative terms, they're having difficulty, but I think they're not having as much difficulty as the UK has had, since decolonization.
Just a couple more questions for you, Tony. Is a new Russian revolution inevitable, and will it happen a lot sooner and easier than everyone thinks? Or does, not necessarily Putin, but the system that Putin works within have such a hold on Russia that the potential for it to be challenged is almost, impossible?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it depends what you mean by revolution to some extent, right? Whether you mean just the overthrow of a regime or whether you mean some massive sort of social upsurge of a kind of 1917 type. I think that kind of social revolution is not currently on the cards in Russia. I think society is much more atomized and more apathetic than that kind of social situation would suggest. And I think for the present regime does have a solid grip on the political landscape. The opportunities for political expression of opinions contrary to the current regime are very limited. But that being said, one of the interesting features of this regime is that it is, on the one hand, it's seemingly very solidly anchored, but on the other hand, I think it is actually quite brittle in some ways. That, for the reasons I was saying earlier, that it doesn't rely on mass mobilization or mass engagement so much as mass acquiescence. And I think if you have a regime that is sort of low intensity like that, it doesn't take that much for opinion to flip. If there is suddenly a more compelling alternative, some other project, some other leader figure or party or collective that promises something more coherent and tempting for people, then I think opinion could shift pretty rapidly. So the question really is what the future of this particular system holds, with or without Putin at the top, is whether it's headed for some kind of more turbulent end and its replacement by some kind of interim sort of coalition government that has to work out a new political structure, or on the contrary, whether there is just a democratic transition of some kind, as I was describing to your listeners earlier, as in the case of Mexico, when the PRI lost power in the year 2000, and it was the opposition party that won with Vicente Fox. So you could imagine that this kind of the Putin system would just run out of steam somewhat, and that would create space for a coherent political alternative to develop that would then be able to take power democratically. I think the latter scenario seems more likely to me of the two I've just laid out. But on the other hand, it's true that more likely than either of those is the continuation of this system on some indefinite basis, and in more or less successful version of what it's doing now. So maybe that's not a satisfactory answer, but I think those are the three options we're going to see.
Tony, one last question for you. We've been speaking with Tony Wood. He is author of Russia Without Putin, Money, Power, and the Myths of the New Cold War. He's a member of the editorial board at New Left Review. And if somebody has been just annoying you on a regular basis about this Russiagate thing, this is the book you need to get them for the holidays so they have a better understanding of Russia. Again, Tony Wood is the author of Russia Without Putin, Money, Power, and the Myths of the New Cold War. One last question for you, Tony, and as we do with all of our guests, our final question is the question from hell. The question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, our audience is going to hate your response. This one's a little bit silly, but is Putin's Russia the Russia that Ayn Rand always wanted?
Yes, I actually think so. That's an easy question, though. That's not a question from hell at all. I think she would love it.
So sweet. All those fans of the Fountainhead who are listening right now, you should move to Russia. It's just waiting there for it. Who is John Galt? I'll tell you who he is. Vladimir Putin. That's who he is. Thank you so much for being on our show this week, Tony.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Take care.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.